You're probably familiar with ROM hacks where a game is slightly modified to change the graphics or levels, usually without permission from the developers. Then there's bootlegs, which are ROM hacks that are sold commercially without authorization. A good example would be some of the Pac-Man bootlegs in the early 80s. But one particular bootleg actually didn't start off as one, it was a product that was officially licensed by Nintendo of all companies. Let's take a look. What's going on, guys? It's Pojer coming at you with another video. Finally got that haircut people have been wanting me to get. So we're going to be talking about Crazy Kong. Special thanks to Blue MSX for the video idea. So if you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit that subscribe button right there. We're about 300 away from 10,000 subscribers. If everybody watching this video subscribes right now, I'll literally get there tomorrow. Speaking of Blue MSX, you know where they actually gave me the idea? Discord. Speaking of which, if you want to join my Discord, just go to discord.pojer.net. We got about 200 people in there right now. Anyway, let's get started. With arcade games like Pac-Man being so successful, it's no secret that companies will try to imitate them. There's games like Ladybug that are meant to be similar to Pac-Man but still qualify as original titles. Of course people like Pac-Man, so maybe more people will play a game that's similar to it. And then there's unauthorized games that are too much like their original counterparts. Rather than making a game from scratch that shares similarities, the pirated games are ROM hacks with small changes. For example, Pac-Man had a bunch of unauthorized clones, like Hangly-Man, which contained modified levels and some extra features. There's also Piranha, which had some changes to the levels and graphics. The motivation for making these pirated games is clear. Pac-Man was very successful, so a game that's like it will definitely get some extra quarters. One company in particular saw some success after making some pirated games. General Computer Corporation, or GCC, made a ROM hack of Missile Command called Super Missile Attack. After seeing some success with the game, they made a ROM hack for Pac-Man called Crazy Auto. However, due to a lawsuit with Atari, GCC ended up working with Midway and Namco to get it published as Ms. Pac-Man rather than distributing the game themselves like they originally planned. But Pac-Man wasn't the only game that had bootleg versions. Another target for pirated games was Donkey Kong. The very first bootleg version of this game didn't originally start off as a bootleg. Donkey Kong was an extremely successful title for Nintendo, more so than they ever thought. In Japan, Nintendo had a shortage of arcade cabinets because of the overwhelming popularity of Donkey Kong, so as a response, they licensed the game to Falcon. By relying on another company to manufacture the game, Nintendo will still be able to meet the demand from consumers without putting too much pressure on themselves. But Falcon didn't just release the game as is, they would change the name to Crazy Kong and make a few other changes. So here's the big question, is it going to be the same game with a couple small alterations, or will this be an advanced ROM hack with noticeable changes? Definitely the former. The levels and characters are all different colors, Donkey Kong's sprite has been slightly modified, and the sound has been changed. None of these changes are for the better, unfortunately. The colors are much uglier than the original game, and the sound is really messy. Donkey Kong's sprite is more intimidating looking, which is probably what they were going for. The title screen is super pathetic. The 1981 text is not centered, and there's no company name. Seems like they made this in like 5 seconds. One good thing I can say about this game is the high score feature. In the original game, you could only type in 3 characters, but here you can put in more. Overall, you can tell just by looking at it that this is a very low quality game. Even though this is officially licensed, it definitely looks and sounds more like a bootleg. Imagine thinking you're getting Donkey Kong only to be surprised by this. So what's the deal here? Why does it look and sound worse than the original? And if Falcon had authorization from Nintendo, why didn't they just keep the original game as is instead of changing a bunch of things? Well, Crazy Kong isn't running off original Donkey Kong hardware. Instead, it's running off the same hardware as Crazy Climber, and all the sound effects in that game were reused in Crazy Kong. I assume Crazy Climber cabinets were readily available, and that's great for Falcon because that solves the supply issues that Nintendo was having. This also might be why Falcon named it Crazy Kong, to pay homage to the hardware that it's running off of. In general, the hardware they used for this game is much more simplistic than Nintendo's, so a lot of future bootlegs of Donkey Kong were in fact Crazy Kong bootlegs. It's worth mentioning that this game is also more difficult than the original Donkey Kong, so perhaps Falcon was trying to attract a different audience for Crazy Kong, similar to how GCC made a harder version of Missile Command to attract a different audience. Falcon realized their game was rough around the edges, so they made a revision, this one being called Crazy Kong Part 2. This one is still pretty rough around the edges, but there's some small improvements. The title screen looks way better for one. They even added a premise at the beginning, where Donkey Kong breaks out of jail. Nintendo's version didn't do this, so this is very cool. The colors are also slightly better too. The orange in the first stage looks much more appealing than the green in the original Crazy Kong. They made some gameplay improvements too. When you beat the game once, the first stage will now have holes that you have to jump through. This is a cool twist on the gameplay because the original Donkey Kong didn't have this. The ending itself looks a bit more well polished than the original too. The cement factory also gets way more difficult in the second run. The cement pans rocket out at a comical speed, and Crazy Kong is having a really good time up there. Overall, this one is more well polished, but it's still rough around the edges. Hopefully, whoever ordered Crazy Kong for the restaurant or arcade received this version and not the other one. So while Crazy Kong was officially licensed by Nintendo, this agreement would not last long when there was increased demand for Donkey Kong. Falcon only had the license to distribute their game in Japan, but when there was high demand for this game in other regions, Falcon worked out a deal with local publisher in those respective regions. The company Elka distributed the cabinets in the UK, Zaccaria published them in Italy, and Elcon Industries published them in the US. Nintendo of America took notice of Crazy Kong and was not happy with it. They filed a lawsuit against Elcon Industries claiming that Crazy Kong was not authorized outside of Japan. Nintendo would win this case and production had to be stopped. Falcon was only supposed to distribute Crazy Kong in Japan, but they got greedy and brought it over to other regions that they weren't supposed to. This is actually kind of similar to Midway, who was only supposed to distribute the original Pac-Man, but instead published a bunch of Pac-Man sequels with little to no involvement from Namco. With Falcon going behind their back, Nintendo wasn't happy and they would end their agreement with them. However, Falcon wasn't done. With the success of Donkey Kong Jr. in 1982, Falcon would make their own sequel. Except this time, Falcon was no longer partnered with Nintendo, so any follow-up to Crazy Kong would be a true bootleg. Despite no longer being affiliated with Nintendo, they would release Crazy Kong Jr., also known as Crazy Jr. This game is a lot more mysterious than the previous two titles by Falcon. As far as I know, a ROM for this game has never been dumped, and I wasn't able to find any screenshots of what the game looks like. We do have some pictures of the arcade cabinet and the marquee, and we can see that the logo looks very similar to the original Crazy Kong one, which in itself is very similar to the original Donkey Kong marquee. Not nearly as much is known about this particular game. In fact, only 4 known people actually own this cabinet, at least in the preservation community. I'm sure there's probably others out there though. As you would expect, Nintendo was not happy with this unauthorized version of Donkey Kong Jr. Just to reiterate, Crazy Kong was an authorized game that was released in unauthorized territories. Crazy Jr., on the other hand, was never an authorized game. Nintendo would file a criminal complaint, and the president of Falcon would end up being arrested for this. This is the first arrest ever made, at least that we know of, for making unauthorized copies of a game in Japan. Perhaps in the future, Nintendo should be more careful with who they choose to do business with. With Nintendo having supply issues, they relied on Falcon to distribute Donkey Kong. Their first game, Crazy Kong, was extremely sloppy. The colors were poorly selected, the sound was horrible, and the title screen looks pathetic. Crazy Kong Part 2 was a small improvement. The colors look a little better, the levels change as you progress through the game, the title screen is improved, and there's even a cutscene that wasn't in the original Donkey Kong. Still rough around the edges, but better than the first Crazy Kong. Falcon overstepped their boundaries by releasing it in other regions they weren't supposed to, but it's crazy, no pun intended, that a bootleg started out as an official title. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.